On Monday the 17th of October 1814, as the Napoleonic Wars neared their end, London was shocked by one of the most bizarre tragedies ever to befall the historic city, when a 15-foot tsunami of beer killed 8 people on the city's streets. This is the story of the Great London Beer Flood of 1814. Now, apart from being a slightly weird history story, I wanted to share this with you because, having done a couple of videos about the War of 1812 between Britain and America, I wanted to paint a picture of the social conditions that drove working class men to join the British Army during the Napoleonic Wars. Many films about this period portray the British Redcoats as a rather glamorous group of men, which is far from the reality. Apart from the obvious dangers of being killed in action or permanently disabled, which could lead to a life of poverty, the life of a common soldier was not for the faint-hearted. For a start, it was not a well-paid profession. The pay of an infantry private in 1814 was £1 a day, which is about £2.50 in today's money. About a third of what a skilled tradesman back in Britain could earn. The conditions were harsh, with flogging still a regular punishment, stocks being worn as part of their uniform around their necks, and field conditions basic to say the least. It wasn't until 1813, for instance, that common soldiers were issued with tents. Until then, when on active service, they would simply sleep under their blankets out in the elements. Sometimes they might put a few of the blankets together and prop them up like a non-waterproof tent. Tropical diseases, shipwrecks, or the surgeon's operating table were very real threats to cutting your life short too. To be quite honest, the army life for a common soldier was not a career for a respectable man. Even later on in the 19th century, this was the case. Those of you who've watched my story about Sir William Robertson, DSO, who rose from the ranks to Field Marshal, might remember his description of the soldiers he was recruited with in 1877 as rough, hard-drinking, hard-swearing soldiers drawn from the very lowest rungs of society. If you might remember, his mother was so distraught in the 1870s with his decision to join the army that she wrote to him saying she was ashamed and that she would rather bury him than see him in a red coat. So just imagine what you were leaving behind if you thought this was the better option. The Duke of Wellington famously described his common soldiers as the scum of the earth. Which brings us to the 17th of October 1814 and the London Beer Flood. The Horse Shoe Brewery stood at the junction of Tottenham Court Road and Great Russell Street, where the Dominion Theatre now stands. And behind it, at the time, was one of the most notorious slums in London, St Giles Rookery. London had several of these rookeries, so called after the noisy, higgledy-piggledy nests set up by rooks in trees. The area had once been genteel, but had descended into its notoriety in the early 1700s. And even by the 1750s, 60 years before our story, it was infamous for its illicit activities, the haunt of criminal gangs, prostitutes, gambling dens and gin houses. Hogarth's famous etching of Gin Lane with all its social vices was modelled on St Giles Rookery. And by 1814, things hadn't changed, and indeed nor were they to change for another 50 years. In the 1830s, Charles Dickens wrote a social commentary about these very slums in his Sketches by Boz. And this is how he describes this area, which at this time was home to over 30,000 people. Wretched houses with broken windows, patched with rags and paper. Every room let out to a different family, and in many instances, 2 or 3. Filth everywhere, a gutter before the house and a drain behind. Clothes drying and slops emptying from the windows. Girls of 14 or 15 with matted hair walking around barefoot and in white great coats, almost their only covering. Boys of all ages in coats of all sizes and no coats at all. Men and women in every variety of scanty and dirty apparel, lounging, scolding, drinking, squabbling, fighting and swearing. The area was overcrowded, as Dickens indicates, with up to 3 families living in just one room. There were over 1,000 people living in Church Lane alone, which was just one of the streets in St Giles Rookery. Many families even lived in basement cellars that back in the day had been storerooms for the big houses. Below ground level, in those unsanitary slums, those basements were not just a health hazard, but they were death traps too, as we're going to find out very soon. If these people, and many of them were immigrants, especially Irish immigrants, could find employment, it was in jobs that no one else wanted to do. Rag picking, street sweeping, waste removal. Many drifted into criminal gangs or prostitution. It's hardly surprising that when this was all that life had to offer, many men volunteered for the army during the Napoleonic Wars. And the army was more than happy to take them, as it grew from 40,000 at the outset of the wars with France in 1793 to over 250,000 by 1813. But our story doesn't go off on Wellington or Sharpe-style adventures fighting the French and others all over the world. It stays here in London, because even in the midst of war, civilians die too. Before I go on, if you're enjoying this so far, please give me a like or subscribe to my channel. The Horse Shoe Brewery was owned by Sir Henry Meux, who had bought the brewery in 1810. And within a year, it was the 6th biggest brewery in London, producing 103,000 barrels of porter beer every year. Now, porter, as we don't drink it a lot now and don't see it on sale very much, but it was a dark black beer, reasonably similar to stouts, the most famous of which, of course, is Guinness. And at that period in history, it was a highly popular drink, especially in London. Henry Meux had installed massive 22-foot high tanks at the brewery, and in these, the porter beer was fermented for anything up to a year. Now, just to put that into perspective, 22 foot high is not far off the height of this house. These gigantic tanks were made of wood and therefore were held in place by huge metal bands, each of which weighed in at 700 pounds. At around 4:40 p.m. on the afternoon of Monday the 17th of October, 1814, storehouse clerk George Crick noticed that one of these bands had slipped down a barrel. As he later told the coroner, this was not uncommon, so he just wrote a note to one of the partners, Mr. Young, bringing the issue to his attention and requesting a repair. It was about an hour later, having completed the letter, that he heard an almighty bang from the fermentation room. Racing in, he saw the damaged vat had now completely ruptured and was pouring beer through the brewery. The force of the explosion had caused a chain reaction with the other vats there, and they too were exploding and emptying gallons and gallons of dark beer onto the floor. The beer explosion had also demolished the 25-foot high brick wall at the back of the brewery. The bricks were 2.5 inches thick, so we're talking a heck of an explosion. And through this hole, 320,000 gallons of porter beer, that's about 2.5 million pints, were now escaping into the streets of London. Or that's what it looked like to George Crick. What people outside the brewery saw was a 15-foot tidal wave of hot fermenting black beer, plus numerous bricks from the wall and other debris, coming straight at them. And this beer tsunami swept straight into the slum dwellings in St Giles Rookery. First stop, New Street and George Street. The porter beer poured into those basements of the tenement buildings, which, as I said earlier, were not cellars for storage, but now they were people's homes. In one basement, Mary Banfield was taking tea with her 4-year-old daughter Hannah and Hannah's friend. The black liquid poured into their basement, rapidly filling it to the ceiling. Somehow Mary and her daughter's friend were carried out by the flood and deposited in Tottenham Court Road. Little Hannah, her daughter, was not so lucky. She was the first victim of the London beer flood. Further down New Street, Irish mourners were attending the wake of a 2-year-old boy who had died the previous day, and the wake was being held in a basement. All 5 mourners, including the boy's mother and another 3-year-old boy, were drowned. Further down the same street, in another basement, yet another child was trapped. 3-year-old Sarah Bates was later found dead as the beer levels subsided. At the nearby pub, the Tavistock Arms, teenage barmaid Eleanor Cooper was washing pans in the backyard when, with an almighty roar, the tidal wave of beer hit the outside wall with such force that the yard wall collapsed onto the helpless barmaid. The pub landlord was joined by neighbours as they desperately dug through the rubble to try and rescue her, but when they finally reached her, she'd already passed away. In all, 8 people died, all in the slums of St Giles Rookery. Amazingly, there were no deaths at the brewery itself, although 3 workers had to be dug out of the rubble and sent to hospital. News of the freak disaster spread rapidly and crowds began to gather at the site. With over 2 million pints of porter, London's favourite tipple, sloshing around free of charge in the streets, people started to bring containers to grab some free beer. Some folk even dispensed with the containers and, cupping their hands, they went on the weirdest and probably wildest pub crawl in London's history. There were reports that one person actually died from alcohol poisoning for drinking so much of the beer, although there's no factual evidence to back that urban myth up, so it probably remains just an urban myth. What was true was that watchmen at the brewery charged sightseers to gulp at the damaged vats. Also true, and even more bizarre and macabre, was that some of the relatives of the victims exhibited the corpses of their loved ones and charged Londoners to have a good look. Indeed, there were so many visitors in one house having a good look at the deceased that the floor collapsed, depositing all the sightseers into the beer-filled cellar below. It took several weeks for the beer to finally drain away. For those of us old enough to remember pubs back in the day, boozers before they became gastro pubs, do you remember that stale beer smell? Well, imagine the stench that 2.5 million pints of porter beer or Guinness probably had in the area. And that smell supposedly stayed in the area for months afterwards. Sir Henry Meux and his brewery were taken to court, but in the end the court decided that the victims had been lost due to an act of God, and no compensation was due to their families. Which probably was a relief to Sir Henry Meux, because his brewery had already lost £23,000 from the escaped porter, plus the damage to the brewery itself, so that was about £1 million in today's money. They were in danger of going bankrupt without any compensation, and so they petitioned Parliament and were able to reclaim the excise duties that had already paid in advance on the beer. They were reimbursed. They were also able to claim £7,000 in those days' money compensation from their insurers. They continued to brew beer on the site until 1921, when Meux moved to larger premises in Wandsworth. They finally went into liquidation in 1961, being acquired by Allied Breweries. After Meux had moved out, the Horse Shoe Brewery was sold off in 1921. Following year it was demolished to make way for the Dominion Theatre, which stands on the site to this day. The 17th of October 1814, the Great London Beer Flood, a slightly weird story from history, but in its own little way, it builds the back picture to so many of the other stories that I tell in my videos. Thanks for watching, and I hope you enjoyed that video and found the story interesting. Don't forget to give me a like, and how about joining my History Chap supporters club? What's that all about? Well, click on the link that's going to appear in a moment. Loads more videos coming your way, but in the meantime, keep well, and I'll see you very soon.